Late autumn, 167 BC, Rome. For 3 uninterrupted days, an unprecedented procession flows like a river through the streets of the Eternal City. 250 heavily laden wagons carry captured marble statues, giant bronze shields, and breathtaking paintings. Behind them march 750 men, bent double under the crushing weight of massive vessels filled with silver. This deafening clanking and ringing echoes through every single street. But the Roman mob isn't looking at the gold. All eyes are glued to a man slowly trudging in heavy iron chains behind the gilded chariot of the victorious general Aemilius Paullus. This is no chieftain of some barbarian tribe. Before us stands the king of Macedon, the final ruler of the Antigonid dynasty, the direct heir to the martial glory of Alexander the Great. His name is Perseus, and his presence in shackles on the streets of Rome conceals one of the most absurd mysteries in all of ancient history. Usually empires collapse when their treasuries are bled dry, their armies are shattered in decades of endless campaigns, and their city walls are swept away by siege engines. But Perseus surrendered to the Romans with 10,000 talents of pure silver still in his possession. This money would have been more than enough to maintain dozens of mercenary armies. He inherited a state from his father that was at the absolute zenith of its economic power. In the Macedonian granaries lay enough wheat to sustain 10 years of continuous, uninterrupted warfare. In the barracks stood a highly disciplined, perfectly drilled army that in its very first decisive clash with the Romans sent the legions running for their lives. He had absolutely everything he needed to halt Roman expansion and become the sole savior of Greece. And yet he didn't lose his state due to the brilliant genius of enemy generals. He lost his kingdom because of his own miserly accounting calculations. By this point, Rome had already sunk deep roots into the Balkans. The Roman commander, Titus Quintius Flaminius, had cleverly sold the Greeks the illusion of independence, while the previous king, Philip V, the father of Perseus, had executed his own younger son, Demetrius, in a fit of pure paranoia. It was Perseus who slipped his father an expertly forged Roman letter, effectively sentencing his own brother to death just to clear his own path to the throne. He seized power through treachery and blood, absolutely certain that he could outplay the Republic. But Perseus' collision with Rome is not some heroic epic about a glorious final stand. It is a dark, grim, tragic comedy about the nature of human greed. There is no place here for tales of noble, fallen warriors. Instead, we are about to witness the story of a ruler who haggled over every single coin while standing on the very edge of the abyss. Macedon's path to its final day will take us from the populist promises of a new king who threw open the doors of the debtors' prisons to the bloody meat grinder at the city of Pydna, where the legendary Macedonian phalanx would permanently lose its invincibility in the fog and chaos of broken, uneven terrain. A state does not perish from the first strike of an enemy's sword. It crumbles to dust the exact moment an attempt to pinch pennies on allies turns the sovereign of a mighty empire into a prisoner begging to have his life spared. Let's begin. Autumn, 179 BC. Inside the royal chambers of the palace, an old man breathes heavily. This is Philip V, the monarch who, for half a century, kept Hellas gripped in fear and dared to challenge Rome itself. Now he is fading away, broken not by enemy swords, but by the crushing guilt of his own son's death. There is no loving family gathered around his deathbed. Soon the king draws his final breath, and absolute power over Macedon passes to his eldest son. He is 33 years old. He places the royal diadem upon his head and steps out to face his troops. This man's name is Perseus. In the crowd of Macedonian aristocrats bowing their heads before their new sovereign, many avert their eyes. In their silence hides a dangerous question. Does he even have the right to wear this crown? For decades, whispers had circulated through the court that Perseus was a bastard. It was widely believed that his mother, the Argive Polycratia, lacked legitimate royal rights, and that he himself was inferior in noble blood to other claimants. Regardless of their truth, these rumors permanently fractured the king's psyche. Perseus grew up with the deep-seated conviction that he had to prove his right to exist every single day. This fear warped into an all-consuming obsession when it came to his younger brother, Demetrius. The young man embodied everything Perseus so desperately lacked: youth, effortless charisma, and soaring popularity among the people. But Demetrius' main advantage harbored a direct existential threat. Following Macedon's crushing defeat at Cynocephalae, the boy had been sent to Rome as an honorary hostage. He grew up on the Capitoline Hill, formed close bonds with influential senators, including the famous general Titus Quinctius Flamininus, and returned home as the Republic's unofficial candidate for the throne of Pella. The Senate openly paraded their blatant favoritism for Demetrius, intentionally humiliating the aging Philip and completely ignoring the very existence of Perseus. The mathematics of power were crystal clear. As long as his brother drew breath, the crown would never be his. The Romans would simply place their darling favorite on the throne the moment Philip closed his eyes. Direct physical elimination would have provoked the wrath of their father and triggered an immediate invasion by the Roman legions. A weapon far more subtle than a sword was required. In 181 BC, the royal advisors Philocles and Apelles return from a diplomatic mission to Italy. They bring Philip V a sealed scroll. The wax impression unmistakably belongs to Flamininus' signet ring. Inside is a fatal message. The Roman purportedly asks Philip to be lenient toward Demetrius, casually confessing that the young man had discussed plans with him to seize the throne with the Republic's armed backing. The scroll was a brilliant forgery. Perseus had conspired with the retinue, manufactured an exact replica of the seal, and put the very words Philip feared most into the mouth of his Roman enemy. The old king, who had lived for years in absolute terror of a new Roman invasion, finally breaks. The primal instinct of state self-preservation overpowers his paternal affection. Philip gives the order. Demetrius is secretly poisoned to death on his way to a mountain fortress during the winter of 181/180 BC. Perseus was triumphant. His rival had been eliminated by his own father's hands, and Rome was suddenly stripped of its puppet candidate. The path to the throne was completely cleared. But right here lay the bitter irony of his fate. Perseus believed this forged letter was the ultimate guarantee of his future. In reality, this single scrap of parchment utterly destroyed the moral foundation of the Macedonian state. Soon enough, the truth about the falsification surfaced. Philip discovered he had sent an innocent son to his death. In his despair, he cursed the murderer and desperately attempted to pass the throne to his nephew Antigonids, the son of Echecrates, just to sever Perseus' bloodline. Death claimed Philip before he could enforce this decision by force of arms, but the bedrock of trust was forever shattered. Perseus finally received the crown he had dreamed of his entire life. The king sat upon a throne stained deep with his brother's blood, while his own subjects looked upon him with thinly veiled horror. The new monarch desperately needed the support of the Macedonians and the Greeks to stand against Rome, which had no intention of forgiving the murder of its favorite. To buy this loyalty, the ruler decides to do something utterly unheard of. He orders the heavy doors of the debtors' prisons to be thrown open and invites political exiles back into the country. Populism instantly becomes his primary weapon. Macedonia, in the summer of 179 BC, resembled a spring compressed to its absolute limit. 3 decades of continuous, grueling wars, the forced relocations of entire peoples, and the sheer terror inflicted by the late Philip V had left behind a country suffocating from mutual distrust. Many noble Macedonians were rotting away in political exile, wandering from one foreign court to another, from Syria to Egypt. In Pella itself, the debtors' prisons were bursting at the seams with those who simply could not pay their taxes into a royal treasury drained by years of endless military campaigns. In antiquity, a debt to the state did not mean a civilized bankruptcy procedure. It meant the complete loss of freedom, heavy iron shackles, and the horrifying prospect of selling your own children on the slave markets. The paralyzing fear of the future permeated society from top to bottom. It is precisely into this tense, suffocating silence that the new monarch steps. Perseus understands his vulnerability perfectly well. He has inherited a throne stained with the blood of his own brother. To the old Macedonian aristocracy, he is nothing but an ambitious, scheming intriguer who murdered Rome's legitimate favorite. To the Roman Republic itself, he is a highly unpredictable threat on their eastern borders. If the new ruler attempts to govern with an iron fist, following his father's brutal example, the societal tension will inevitably boil over into open rebellion. And so, the king decides to wield the most ancient weapon of a weak ruler. He simply buys their love. Perseus launches a massive campaign of state-sponsored populism. In a single day, with the mere stroke of a pen, he forgives all debts owed to the crown. The heavy wooden doors of the Macedonian prisons swing wide open, releasing thousands of inmates convicted of crimes against the state back into the light of day. But the monarch goes even further. Heralds race to all the Hellenistic courts, bearing an official edict of sweeping amnesty. All fugitives, exiles, and political enemies of the previous regime are guaranteed total safety and the immediate return of their confiscated properties. Perseus' actions leave his contemporaries absolutely stunned. The Greek world, entirely accustomed to the ruthless cruelty of Macedonian lords, freezes in pure admiration. A political exile in antiquity was a man without a face, stripped of all civil rights, doomed to survive on crumbs from foreign tables, while hoarding a bitter hatred for his homeland. Returning their homes and their status meant instantly transforming sworn, bitter enemies into fiercely loyal supporters. Behind this overwhelming generosity lay a cold, calculated strategy. Perseus genuinely believed that by erasing his father's tyrannical decrees, he was cementing the nation around himself and building a unified Greek front against the looming Roman threat. But the harsh reality of the political stage dictated entirely different laws. By buying the loyalty of the mob and pardoning traitors, the king kept perfectly intact the exact same aggressive, militaristic foreign policy course that had plunged his father's country into terror in the first place. These populist gestures, designed to make him adored in the eyes of the Hellenes and smooth over internal conflicts, merely signaled to the Roman Senate that the new king was rapidly and highly successfully consolidating his power, and the Republic never forgave another's success. Perseus won the first round in the battle for mines. The prisons emptied, and the great squares of Pella and Thessalonica rejoiced, loudly praising the limitless mercy of their monarch. But the cheers of an ecstatic crowd cannot stop the relentless advance of consular legions. Domestic popularity alone is never enough to prove your status as a great power to the entire known world. Perseus needed to blind the world with the sheer scale of his resources to prove that the silver lying in his vaults exceeded the budgets of entire continents. To achieve this, the king turns to high-stakes diplomacy, preparing the most grandiose marital alliances of the century. His master plan is to bind Macedon with unbreakable blood ties to the greatest kingdoms of the East. But within this very strategy hid a fatal vulnerability. The blinding glitter of gold at these lavish weddings would not only attract the admiring gazes of the Greeks, but it would also awaken the ravenous hunger of those political predators who simply cannot be bought with amnesty. Almost 20 years after Titus Quincius Flamininus shattered the Macedonian phalanx at Cynocephalae and stripped the kingdom of its hegemony, Rome had grown comfortably accustomed to viewing the Balkans as a permanently solved problem. The senators arrogantly assumed they had forever broken the spine of Antigonid power. They were dead wrong. While the Republic spent years reveling in its triumph, a cornered Philip V spent the last decade of his life meticulously building an economic machine. Perseus' father acted not as a battlefield commander, but as a ruthless crisis manager. He reopened the long-abandoned gold and silver mines in Thrace and on Mount Pangaeum, aggressively jacked up port duties, and forcibly relocated entire populations just to stimulate agricultural production. By 178 BC, the vaults of the royal treasuries in Pella were practically bursting with silver and vast stockpiles of premium grain, capable of feeding an enormous army continuously for 10 solid years. Perseus didn't inherit a bleeding, exhausted province. he was handed the keys to the most well-funded military base in the entire Mediterranean. The new king decides it's time to demonstrate this colossal power to the world. But instead of rattling sabers on his borders, the ruler opts for a series of magnificent dynastic marriages. He weds his sister Apama to King Perseus II of Bithynia, the very same monarch who had once betrayed Hannibal and who now controlled the most critical trade routes near the Black Sea. But the crown jewel of this diplomatic offensive is Perseus' own marriage. His chosen bride is announced to be Laodice V, a royal princess from the mighty Seleucid Empire. The pure logistics of this wedding resembled a massive naval parade. To transport his bride from Syria to Macedon, Perseus completely rejects a modest escort. Instead, he hires and fully equips the entire combat fleet of Rhodes. Multi-decked war galleys, glittering with gold and dripping in purple, slice across the Aegean Sea before the eyes of dozens of independent polis. This grand expedition served as far more than just a royal ferry service. It was an overwhelming demonstration of sheer wealth, screaming to the entire Mediterranean world, the East and Macedon are united once again. Meanwhile, the Macedonian mints are working non-stop, churning out heavy silver tetradrachms. On their reverse, the eagle of Zeus spreads its wings, encircled by an oak wreath with the deeply engraved name of King Perseus. These coins flow like a waterfall into the pockets of Greek politicians, buying loyalty and actively erasing the memory of past grievances. Perseus fully expected this strategy to work flawlessly. He was weaving a dense, dynastic spiderweb between Asia and Europe, hoping that the blinding gleam of his treasury and his deep kinship with powerful neighbors would forge an impenetrable shield, making Rome too terrified to risk starting a new war. In reality, every single ship of the Rhodian fleet and every freshly minted tetradrachm struck the nerves of the Roman Senate far harder than the march of fully armed legions ever could. His attempt to buy a cast-iron guarantee of security turned out to be the down payment on his own death sentence. His lavish display of luxury awakened the Republic's deepest, most primal fear of a revived, unstoppable empire. Golden weddings and overflowing granaries simply made Macedon too tempting of a target. While Perseus was busy celebrating his diplomatic triumph in Pella, across the sea, a man had already stepped forward, ready and willing to turn all this glitter into ash. A man whose own territories directly bordered Macedonian interests, and who knew exactly which doors to knock on in the Senate to provoke an absolute catastrophe. Early 172 BC. Stepping before the Roman patricians is not a hardened general in heavy armor, but a man draped in the exquisite flowing robes of a Hellenistic sovereign. This is Eumenes II, the king of Pergamum. He has crossed the Mediterranean Sea with one singular goal: to convince the Republic to launch a global war. Eumenes systematically, digit by digit, details the existential threat radiating from Macedon. He speaks of 30,000 superbly trained infantrymen, of vicious Thracian mercenaries, of Pella's secret alliances, and of a royal treasury capable of funding a 10-year bloodbath without missing a single payment. Perseus had hosted his grandiose golden weddings and minted his heavy tetradrachms in the firm belief that a display of limitless wealth would terrify his enemies and guarantee his safety. In reality, this blinding brilliance struck Eumenes with absolute terror, forcing the Pergamene king to personally sail to Italy just to sic the Roman legions on Macedon. The attempt to wall himself off from Rome with diplomatic luxury had only accelerated a direct, open collision. The Senate listens to the Pergamene king with highly favorable attention. However, to mobilize a 100,000-strong army, the Republic requires more than just slick political speeches. Roman law demanded a casus belli, a formal, legally justified pretext for a massive invasion, and Perseus, committing an unfathomable, catastrophic error, personally hands them this very pretext on a silver platter. Eumenes travels back to Asia through Greece. Playing the role of a pious pilgrim, he decides to visit the sacred sanctuary of Delphi. The path to the oracle of Apollo winds along a narrow, treacherous mountain trail, squeezed tight by sheer, towering cliffs. The Pergamene ruler slowly trudges up the mountain, surrounded by a modest retinue, completely unaware that behind a crumbling wall on the edge of the precipice, hired assassins are already lying in wait. In antiquity, political eliminations rarely relied on refined, subtle poisons. Much more often, crude, brutally violent physical force was the method of choice. Just as Eumenes draws level with the ambush, a devastating hail of heavy boulders rains down from above. The first massive rock shatters the king's shoulder. The second strikes him squarely in the head. The monarch plummets from the narrow trail and violently tumbles down the steep, rocky slope, instantly losing consciousness. His gods completely abandon their master and scatter in terror. The assassins, peering down at the lifeless, bleeding body at the bottom of the gorge, decide their contract has been brilliantly fulfilled and melt away into the mountains. The rumor of Eumenes' violent death flies to Rome faster than the swiftest courier ships. Carefully orchestrated, explosive fury erupts in the Senate. The Republic's primary ally had been targeted for assassination, and to make matters infinitely worse, the hit took place on the sacred, holy ground of Delphi, desecrating every single religious law in existence. It would later be revealed that the Pergamene king actually survived, miraculously recovering from his horrific injuries in a secret hideout on the island of Aegina. But for the grand machinery of geopolitics, this detail no longer mattered in the slightest. Rome receives its flawless pretext. The Senate loudly and officially declares Macedon an enemy of the state, and Perseus himself a vile sacrilegist. The very legions that had so recently crushed Carthage and broken the spine of the Seleucid Empire receive immediate orders to board transport ships. The king, who had spent decades desperately trying to avoid an open conflict, was suddenly faced with a relentless, terrifying reality. The war hadn't just begun. It was already standing on the very threshold of his palace. The diplomatic games were officially over. The Macedonian sovereign, watching the consular armies disembark in Thessaly, finally understands that diplomatic alliances will no longer protect his borders. The time had come to lead his troops onto the battlefield. The Roman commanders marched on the offensive, fully expecting a swift, utterly unconditional capitulation. They expected to see a terrified, cowering monarch and trembling ranks of infantry. But they failed to account for one crucial detail. Their neat calculations completely overlooked a Macedonian military machine that had spent years quietly hoarding its strength, endlessly training in brutal border skirmishes to the north. Near the hill of Callinicus, in the choking dust of the Thessalian plain, the Roman vanguard will suddenly crash into a dark, terrifying tidal wave of heavy cavalry. And this brutal encounter will force the invincible Roman legions, for the first time in many years, to break and retreat in total chaos. Spring 171 BC. Roman legions march steadily along the dusty roads of the Thessalian plain. Consul Publius Licinius Crassus leads his forces north, hungrily anticipating an effortless, glorious campaign. The Senate firmly believed they were facing a terrified Hellenistic monarch whose bravery began and ended with paid assassinations and bribery. In reality, Perseus marched out to meet them with a massive, highly disciplined army that had been gathering its immense strength through long years of peace. The Romans were marching toward what they thought was a routine triumph, entirely unaware of the ambush waiting for them, while the Macedonian king, more than anything else in the world, was absolutely terrified of actually winning this battle. A May morning near the hill of Callinicus, battle formations are drawn up in the sun-scorched valley. Crassus pushes his cavalry and light infantry forward, 20,500 men in total. The legionaries are expecting a standard, low-stakes reconnaissance skirmish, but the horizon suddenly darkens with dust. 18,000 heavily armed Macedonian cavalrymen and fierce Thracian mercenaries slam into the Roman ranks at a full, thunderous gallop. The Roman front line instantly splinters. The dense formation of maniples is ripped apart under the crushing blows of the heavy cavalry. Heavy Roman shields are splintered to pieces by the vicious strikes of curved Thracian blades. The Roman vanguard is completely broken. A chaotic, panicked rout begins as the legionaries retreat in total disarray toward the safety of their fortified camp. Perseus suddenly has the chance to utterly obliterate the consular army. He merely has to give the order to his heavy infantry, and the legions will be wiped from the face of the earth. But at the very height of this triumph, as the enemy is actively fleeing the battlefield, the Macedonian monarch orders the trumpets to sound the retreat. He completely halts the pursuit. The Romans are saved, scurrying behind the defensive earthworks of their camp. Why did a victorious commander voluntarily forfeit a total massacre? 18,000 elite soldiers is a devastating force. Alexander the Great had once launched the conquest of Asia with roughly the same number of cavalry. Perseus had the perfect chance to deal the Republic a truly crushing blow. But his mind was hopelessly stuck operating within the outdated framework of old Hellenistic diplomacy. The king believed that war obeyed strict, civilized rules. You win a decisive pitched battle, then both sides sit down at the table and sign a mutually agreeable compromise treaty. The very next day, Perseus confidently dispatches envoys to the Roman camp. He offers Crassus peace on the exact same terms his father Philip had accepted 30 years prior after his own defeat. The Macedonian attempts to leverage his fresh tactical victory as his primary bargaining chip, and here his comfortable familiar logic violently shatters against a merciless, unforgiving reality. Consul Crassus, having just lost thousands of men and barely escaped with his life and public dignity intact, coldly replies to the Macedonian ambassadors. Rome demands absolute, unconditional surrender. Perseus is completely stunned. He has collided with a fundamentally alien approach to warfare. Romans do not negotiate when they are losing. They negotiate exclusively when the enemy is on their knees. The tactical victory at Callinicus instantly morphed into a strategic dead end for the king. He had won the battle, but realized with creeping horror that he could never end this war through peace. Macedon urgently needed an overwhelming numerical advantage to crush the Republican armies once and for all. And so, Perseus turns his gaze far to the north, where tens of thousands of Celtic mercenaries roam, eager to wage war for Macedonian silver. He calls upon these brutal tribes for help, holding the keys to his own salvation deep in the vaults of Pella. But when this gigantic barbarian army finally arrives at his borders, the ruler will make one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. His attempt to pinch pennies on paying his own mercenaries will cost him his entire nation. 169 BC. The third year of the war with Rome is aggressively draining Macedon's resources. Roman consuls are spinning their wheels, utterly unable to punch through Pella's deep mountain defenses. But time itself is actively working against the Antigonids. Isolated defense means a slow, inevitable death. Perseus fully realizes that to survive, he desperately needs a massive, broad coalition. He needs allies ready to strike the legions in the flank and rear, and the king happens to possess the ultimate, universal key to forging any alliance: the colossal stockpiles of silver accumulated by his father. Lying in his palace vaults are tens of thousands of talents, easily enough to buy half the known world. Perseus initiates a high-stakes, secret diplomatic game. His very first target is the man who single-handedly started this war, King Eumenes of Pergamum, the exact same ruler who miraculously survived the assassination attempt at Delphi. Watching the vaunted Roman military machine stall out in the Balkan Mountains, the Pergamene king decides to ruthlessly monetize his status. In the strictest secrecy, Eumenes dispatches couriers to his sworn enemy with a blunt, purely transactional business proposal. The price for Pergamen's strict neutrality is 500 talents. The price for a full, binding peace treaty with Rome, which Eumenes promises to personally lobby for, is 1,500 talents. 1,500 talents equates to almost 40 tons of pure silver. An astronomical sum, but perfectly affordable for the bulging Macedonian treasury. It could have ended the war overnight, saved thousands of lives, and permanently preserved the state's independence. The historian Polybius, describing these shadowy backroom negotiations, characterizes them as a ridiculously laughable boxing match where cunning squared off against pure greed. Perseus enthusiastically agrees to the 1,500 talents, but sets his own strict condition. The money must be transported and securely hidden in a temple on the island of Samothrace, pending the final signing of the peace treaty. It sounds completely logical, but there's a catch. This island is heavily garrisoned by Macedonian troops. The Pergamene king instantly spots the trap and demands at least the 500 talents up front as a cash deposit. And right here, Perseus digs his heels in. Risk his precious silver without cast iron guarantees? The entire deal collapses simply because the king stubbornly refuses to hand over a down payment. Next, a brilliant opportunity for a turning point opens up on his western borders. The Illyrian king Gentiusa, perpetually drunk tyrant who murdered his own brother for power, offers Perseus to open a second front against Rome. For his invaluable services, the barbarian asks for a mere 300 talents. Perseus is ecstatic. He immediately dispatches envoys to Illyria, swears oaths of eternal friendship, and orders heavy oak wagons to be loaded to the brim with silver. The caravan, heavily guarded by the royal guard, sets off toward the border. The moment he hears that Macedonian gold is approaching, Gentius immediately kicks off the war. He publicly throws Roman ambassadors into a dark dungeon, thoroughly burning all his bridges with the Republic. At this exact moment, the Macedonian monarch makes an unrecoverable, fatal miscalculation. Finding out that the Illyrian has already attacked the Romans and that he has absolutely no way back, Perseus abruptly halts the wagons halfway. The king reasons with pure, cold accounting logic. If Gentius is already deeply embroiled in a war with the Republic, why on earth should I give him my silver now? He has to fight them anyway. Couriers immediately turn the heavy carts around, hauling the 300 talents right back into the vaults of Pella. Discovering this vile deception, an enraged and outgunned Gentius loses his war to Rome in record time, throwing the doors wide open for the legions to march right into Macedon from the west. The king truly believed he was playing a genius political chess match, masterfully defending his national reserves from international con artists. In reality, his attempt to manage complex geopolitics like a cheap market stall completely obliterated any chance of a coalition. His boundless wealth had become his jailer. Perseus was far more terrified of losing his shiny coins than he was of losing his crown. In his desperate attempt to outsmart absolutely everyone and save some gold, he personally signed his own state's death warrant. His diplomatic intrigues had turned to ash, leaving Macedon completely and utterly isolated. The Romans began to methodically tighten the noose around his borders. Perseus urgently needed tens of thousands of spears to stand as a living shield against the advancing maniples. And so, the king casts his desperate gaze far to the north, beyond the banks of the Danube, from where a gigantic horde of mercenaries is already descending, lured by the sweet scent of Macedonian gold. But these barbarian tribes will collide at the border, with the exact same obstacle that just buried the king's entire diplomacy. Winter 168 BC. The ring of isolation around Macedon has definitively slammed shut. Diplomacy failed entirely. Potential allies turned away, paralyzed by their terror of the Republic. Macedon desperately needed tens of thousands of fresh soldiers capable of smashing through the formations of the advancing consular armies. And this very force materialized. From the north, beyond the freezing waters of the Danube, a gigantic horde of Bastarnae descended upon the Macedonian borders. 20,000 hardened mercenaries and 1,000 heavy cavalry and 10,000 swift light infantry, specially trained to fight in a lethal, coordinated dance alongside the horsemen. The very earth shook beneath the hooves of their mounts. They knew absolutely nothing of complex geopolitics, but they knew exactly how to kill for the heavy clinking of Macedonian silver, for a Rome that still vividly remembered the absolute horror of the Gallic invasion and the burning of the capital. An enemy like this could have become an unsolvable nightmare, capable of snapping the psychological resilience of the legions in half. Perseus held the ultimate trump card in his hands, one that could effortlessly alter the entire outcome of the war. He just needed to do one simple thing: open the chests and count out the coins. The border of Thrace. The mercenary chieftain Clondicus arrives at the king's camp to collect his promised advance payment. Perseus steps out onto a hill and surveys the vast, sprawling sea of barbarian tents, campfires, and war horses stretching to the horizon. Any other ruler, pinned to the wall by a relentless enemy, would have looked at this mighty horde and seen absolute salvation. But Perseus, staring at this armed multitude, saw only the rapidly shrinking columns of numbers in his accounting ledger. Maintaining a 20,000-strong horde cost an astronomical amount of money. But this sum was still only a tiny fraction of the 10,000 talents sitting like dead weight in the vaults of Pella. His treasury could have paid for these exact mercenaries 10 times over without emptying even halfway. But the sheer terror of parting with the metal entirely overpowered his instinct for self-preservation. Perseus summons Clondicus and proposes a wildly absurd deal. He will hire only 5,000 horsemen. The remaining 15,000 can just turn around and march back home. Chieftain Clondicus fiercely suppresses his rage and coldly inquires, "Will these 5,000 receive the exact same total sum that was promised to the entire army?" Perseus instantly starts haggling. He equivocates, references the terrible danger of internal looting within Macedon, and desperately tries to drive the price down, offering meager, insulting handouts instead of full-weight silver. For the battle-hardened commander of the mercenaries, this pathetic penny-pinching is the final straw. Clondicus abruptly turns his back, spits on the Macedonian promises, and leads his entire 20,000-strong army right back across the Danube. Why did the absolute richest monarch of the ancient world flat out refuse to buy his own life? Perseus genuinely believed that the gold in his vaults was the physical embodiment of the state itself. To spend it meant carving a piece of flesh from his own body, stripping away the very foundation of his power. He comforted himself with rationalizations. The savages were far too dangerous. They would plunder his lands, and 5,000 would have been more than enough for a victory anyway. But the naked truth was that the mere sight of his coins slipping into foreign hands sickened him to the point of physical nausea. Trying to outsmart the mercenaries, he brutally outsmarted himself. The dust from the hooves of the retreating cavalry hadn't even settled yet, but the ultimate fate of Macedon was already sealed. The king had saved his silver. He tightly shut his heavy chests and hung brand new locks on them, immensely proud of his own fiscal prudence. In reality, he had just personally signed his state's death warrant, leaving the Macedonian phalanxes completely alone to face the legions. The barbarians were gone. The final chances for a grand coalition had totally collapsed. Left in complete isolation, Perseus still clung to the belief that the impregnable mountain ranges would shield his borders from the consular armies. But this illusion of safety evaporated in just a few short weeks. The Roman commander, Quintus Marcius Philippus, accomplished the impossible. He marched his legions along treacherous goat paths, straight over the soaring passes of Mount Olympus. The Roman army quite literally fell from the sky, landing in the very heart of Macedonian territory. Seeing enemy standards suddenly flying in his deep rear, the Macedonian ruler wasn't just frightened. He was entirely paralyzed by a blind, primal panic, the exact kind of terror that would soon drive the king to commit an absolutely absurd atrocity against his own people. The shadow of Rome no longer loomed on the distant borders. It crashed down from directly above. The Roman commander, Quintus Marcius Philippus, executed a staggering maneuver that Macedonian strategists had deemed physically impossible. He did not march his legions across heavily fortified plains, but plunged them straight through the jagged peaks and sheer goat paths of the Mount Olympus massif. Thousands of heavily armed legionaries, slipping on ice-slicked boulders, lowered their supply wagons on ropes and quite literally dropped from the heavens straight into the heart of Macedon. When news of this catastrophic breakthrough reaches Perseus, the carefully crafted facade of the unshakable monarch instantly shatters. The king doesn't summon his generals, nor does he frantically sketch new lines of defense. He is consumed by absolute, blinding panic. The owner of the most sophisticated military machine in the Balkans begins screaming out orders that violently contradict every single logic of survival. One rider gallops madly to the port of Thessalonica, to the naval commander Andronicus, carrying strict orders to immediately burn the entire royal fleet to ashes. Another courier flies to the capital, to the Grand Treasurer Nicias. His instruction sounds even more unhinged. Perseus orders him to take the entire state treasury, those exact same mountains of silver he had so stubbornly hidden from the Celtic mercenaries, and hurl every last coin into the sea. Just a few short weeks ago, the monarch had condemned his country to total isolation by refusing to hand over an advance payment to 20,000 barbarians. His gold felt infinitely more vital to him than his freedom. Now, completely terrified by the phantom of the approaching legions, he voluntarily sends the budget of an entire empire straight to the bottom of the Aegean Sea. He prefers to drown the very future of Macedon, just so long as he doesn't have to hand it over to the enemy. However, the Roman offensive suddenly stalls out. The legions, utterly exhausted by the brutal mountain crossing, are forced to halt to replenish their supplies. Perseus finally catches his breath. A horrifying realization washes over him. He has just destroyed his own empire with his very own hands. Desperately scrambling to reverse his apocalyptic mistake, the king sends frantic new orders, immediately canceling the previous ones. Blind luck plays into his hands. Down in Thessalonica, the cautious Andronicus had dragged his feet on lighting the fires, leaving the massive warships entirely unharmed. In Pella, the treasurer Nicias urgently organizes a massive, unprecedented salvage operation. He brings in local sponge divers men who had trained their whole lives to hold their breath for extended periods. Clapping heavy stones to their chests, these men plunge time and time again into the freezing, pitch-black waters, blindly groping the seabed for the heavy chests. Miraculously, they manage to drag almost all of the sunken silver and gold back to the surface. The vast treasures are returned. The officers and the exhausted laborers who pulled off this staggering miracle naturally expect boundless gratitude. Instead, they receive the brutal strike of the executioner's axe. Perseus looks at Andronicus, Nicias, and the shivering, exhausted divers, but he doesn't see saviors. He sees breathing witnesses to his own pathetic weakness. These men knew precisely how the grand heir of Alexander had thrashed about in pure terror, drowning his beloved riches at the mere thought of approaching Romans. To permanently erase the memory of this unbearable shame, the king issues a dark, secret order. Execute both commanders on the spot and slaughter every single diver who participated in the recovery of the treasury, down to the very last man. The monarch washed his reclaimed gold in the blood of the very men who saved it. He genuinely believed that by burying the witnesses, he could somehow bury his own cowardice. But by murdering deeply loyal men just to protect his own fragile ego, Perseus permanently severed himself from his own people. The treasury is full once again. The fleet rides safely at anchor. Perseus has managed to temporarily mask his panic, hastily restoring the fragile illusion of control. He violently pulls his forces together onto the flat, sprawling plain near the city of Pydna, preparing to give the Romans one final, decisive battle. He has his silver, he has his completely untouched phalanx. But on the night before the battle, as two gigantic camps fall silent in tense anticipation, something is about to happen in the sky that will shatter the spirit of the Macedonian army before a single sword is even drawn. June 168 BC. The flat, sun-scorched plain near the city of Pydna. 100,000 men sleep restlessly in two gigantic camps, separated only by a narrow, tense strip of no man's land. In the pitch blackness, these camps look like two massive predators lying in wait. Sentries prowl between endless rows of heavy leather tents. A thick, suffocating silence hangs in the air, heralding a massive pitched battle for absolute control over the entire Balkan Peninsula. The night of June 21st falls. Soldiers glance upward and notice something deeply unsettling. The ultimate outcome of tomorrow's bloody clash will be decided not by the brutal strike of swords, but high up in the heavens. The bright silver disk of the full moon begins to dim. A pitch-black shadow creeps relentlessly across its face, slowly eating away at the edge of the glowing sphere. In the Roman camp, absolute calm reigns. The legionaries only occasionally glance up at the sky, casually continuing to sharpen their heavy swords and meticulously check the leather straps on their shields. The evening prior, they had been gathered together by a military tribune named Gaius Sulpicius Gallus. This man wasn't a mystic priest or an oracle. He was a passionate student of Greek astronomy and geometry. Standing before a massive formation of men who were simple Italian peasant farmers just yesterday, he picked up a plain wooden stick and drew 3 circles in the dirt: the earth, the sun, and the moon. In the 2nd century BC, in an era when rolling thunder was still widely believed to be the booming voice of Jupiter, a Roman officer delivers a dry clinical lecture on celestial mechanics to his troops. He calmly explains that tomorrow night the Earth will position itself perfectly between the sun and the moon. The shadow will block the light, and the moon will simply vanish. He orders his legionaries not to fear it and to raise no alarm. The cold knowledge of the laws of astronomy completely stripped the eclipse of its terrifying mystical power. Across the plain, in the camp of Perseus, no one was busy drawing diagrams in the sand. For the heavily armed phalangites, celestial bodies had always spoken in the dire language of the gods. When the inky shadow completely swallows the moon, leaving behind nothing but a dull, blood-red orb hanging in the sky, the Macedonian camp explodes into sheer, deafening panic. Terrified warriors frantically grab copper basins and bronze goblets, violently smashing their swords against their shields, desperately trying to use the deafening clamor to scare away the invisible, monstrous demons devouring the moon. But the glowing light does not return. Perseus had firmly believed that his greatest challenge would be the deadly Roman gladius short swords and the rapid maneuverability of the enemy maniples. But brutal reality delivered a devastating blow from a direction the king never even considered. The most sophisticated, perfectly drilled military machine of the Hellenistic world cracked wide open, not under the crushing blows of Roman steel, but from a simple trick of shadows in the upper atmosphere. A fatal, paralyzing whisper instantly ripples through the Macedonian ranks. The priests interpret the eclipse with terrifying clarity. The moon symbolizes the king himself. The unnatural darkness that has swallowed it foretells the bloody doom of the royal house and the total collapse of all Macedon. Hardened veterans who had never flinched in the face of war elephants or screaming Galatians find themselves utterly broken. By the time morning breaks, the army of Perseus will have entirely lost its will to resist. The hands of the soldiers still grip their massive 20-foot sarissas, but their spirits have already surrendered to the mercy of the victor. The long night finally recedes. The dawn of June 22nd exposes the dusty plain. The Macedonians slowly form up into their battle formations, grimly awaiting the execution of their celestial sentence. The Romans march out of their camp with the cold, unshakable confidence of men who are absolutely convinced that the gods themselves are clearing their path. Perseus pushes his legendary phalanx forward, desperately banking on the hope that a solid monolithic wall of tens of thousands of pikes will halt the consular legions in their tracks. But in this flawless wall of iron, tiny, fatal breaches are about to tear open, and through those narrow gaps, death will pour in, placing a final, bloody period at the end of the long history of the Macedonian kings. Dawn, June 22nd, 168 BC. The sun-scorched plain near the city of Pydna. The paralyzing night terrors spawned by the blood-red moon have finally receded, replaced by the cold, dry mathematics of war. On the battlefield, the Roman legions of Lucius Aemilius Paullus take their positions directly opposite the massive Macedonian phalanx of King Perseus. At first, the old Macedonian school holds the absolute upper hand. At the blare of a trumpet, tens of thousands of heavy infantrymen lower their 20-foot-long sarissas in terrifying unison. The phalanx instantly transforms into a bristling, impenetrable forest of spears, acting as a single living monolith that advances slowly and relentlessly to the steady beat of the drums. Aemilius Paullus would later confess that in his entire life he had never seen a more terrifying sight. Roman legionaries desperately tried to hack through the thick wooden shafts with their swords, or bat them away with their heavy shields, but it was all utterly useless. The crushing wall of bronze marched mercilessly forward, brutally flattening the Roman front lines. The legions actually began to fall back. But the ultimate outcome of great battles is often decided not by steel, but by geography. Caught up in the heat of pursuit, the massive phalanx marched off the perfectly flat plain. The ground beneath the Macedonians' feet suddenly began to slope upward. Small ravines, treacherous ruts, and hidden rocks began to appear. The flawless formation buckled. It is physically impossible to maintain a solid, unbroken wall of 20-foot spears when one soldier steps up onto a boulder, while the man right next to him plunges down into a ditch. Tiny, jagged breaches began tearing open in the monolithic wall. A gap of 3 feet here, 6 feet over there. Aemilius Paullus instantly recognized the magnificent gift the terrain had handed him. A Roman legion, unlike the rigid, inflexible phalanx, was not a single stiff mechanism, but a flexible collection of highly maneuverable maniples, capable of operating totally autonomously. The consul barked the order, and small, agile groups of Romans flowed like water straight into these narrow, fatal gaps. The grand tactical clash was over. The methodical slaughter had begun. A phalangite holding a heavy sarissa with both hands is incredibly lethal at a distance of 15 feet. But the second an enemy wielding a short gladius sword slips past the iron spearhead, the Macedonian is left almost entirely defenseless. He has nothing left but a tiny, useless dagger and a small shield strapped uselessly to his shoulder. The Romans carved their way deep into the formation and began to methodically, step by bloody step, butcher the heavy infantry in close-quarters combat. The immense density of the formation, which just seconds ago had been the absolute core strength of the Macedonians, now morphed into their ultimate curse. They were packed so tightly, they couldn't even turn around to parry the deadly blows. 20,000 Macedonian soldiers were left bleeding out in the dust at Pydna. Another 6,000 surrendered as prisoners. The absolute pride of the nation, the invincible heavy infantry that had forged the terrifying glory of the Antigonids, simply ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Where exactly was King Perseus during these final agonizing minutes? He was absolutely obligated to throw his heavy cavalry into the meat grinder. 4,000 untouched, elite horsemen waiting on the wings could have smashed into the Roman flanks, plugged the fatal gaps, and saved his dying infantry. But Perseus, watching the total annihilation of his army, violently spun his horse around. The last Macedonian monarch abandoned his dying soldiers and spurred his mount off the battlefield, fleeing frantically toward the capital. Later, desperately trying to salvage some tiny shred of his dignity, he would invent a pathetic, cowardly excuse, claiming that a young foal had kicked him in the leg the day before, and the severe pain physically prevented him from leading his troops into a charge. The grand heir to the glory of Alexander the Great, the ruler who had meticulously hoarded literal mountains of silver in his vaults, traded his honor for a cowardly escape. The monarch took the entirely intact cavalry and galloped away, desperately hoping to hide behind the thick walls of sacred temples. Perseus still stubbornly believed he could survive this catastrophic storm as long as he kept clutching his precious bags of gold tightly to his chest. But you cannot buy off Rome when you no longer possess a country. And the grand finale of this dark tragicomedy will not play out on a dusty battlefield, but on the teeming streets of the Eternal City, where the proud status of a king will be permanently downgraded to the status of a war trophy. The dust swirling over Pydna hadn't even settled before the king was already running for his life. Fleeing the bloody field where 20,000 Macedonians lay dead, Perseus raced frantically toward the coast. He sought ultimate salvation on the island of Samothrace. The choice was no accident. This was the site of the ancient sanctuary of the great gods, a place of absolute, inviolable religious asylum. Shedding a single drop of blood on this sacred earth was considered an unthinkable, world-ending sacrilege. The king desperately believed that the invisible shield of the gods would protect him where the 20-foot sarissas of his Macedonian infantry had failed. The ships were loaded not with vital state archives, nor with the remnants of his fiercely loyal guard. Sailing with the ruler were his two sons, Alexander and Philip, and massive iron-bound chests of silver that practically bent the heavy wooden decks under their immense weight. But escaping Rome within the borders of the Mediterranean turned out to be an utter impossibility. Soon white sails crested the horizon. A Roman fleet under the command of Praetor Gnaeus Octavius arrived in hot pursuit. Octavius did not launch an amphibious assault or storm the sacred sanctuary with drawn swords. Romans were incredibly adept at demonstrating deep piety, especially when it required zero effort. The squadron simply dropped anchor, wrapping the island in a tight, impenetrable ring of blockade. The sacred status of Samothrace instantly transformed from a divine shield into a suffocating prison. The days dragged on, His grand retinue rapidly thinned out, melting away into the dead of night. Perseus sat totally alone among his heavy chests, listening to the crashing waves and the rhythmic creaking of Roman rigging. His grand illusions finally shattered. You cannot eat gold, and you absolutely cannot bribe a Roman commander. At long last, the final monarch of Macedon makes his decision. The grand heir to the glory of Alexander the Great walks slowly out of the temple with his hands raised. He voluntarily surrenders himself and both of his sons as prisoners of war to Gnaeus Octavius. The Romans immediately set about meticulously inventorying their captives' possessions. Even the hardened clerks, completely accustomed to appraising the vast wealth of sacked cities, freeze in absolute disbelief. The ancient historian Justin records the exact sum found with Perseus on Samothrace: 10,000 talents. If you translate this staggering figure into the language of lost opportunities, 10,000 talents is exactly 260 tons of pure silver. Just a few short months prior, the Illyrian king had begged Perseus for 300 talents to rip open a second front and strike the legions in the flank. The Pergamene monarch was entirely willing to sabotage the entire war for a mere 1,500, and the terrifying 20,000-strong horde of Celtic mercenaries had merely asked for an advance payment that would have constituted a microscopic fraction of this vast fortune. The king could have easily hired 3 such hordes and utterly annihilated the legions of Aemilius Paullus. But Perseus physically could not pry open the fingers that gripped his precious metal. The monarch genuinely believed he was hoarding these coins for the ultimate salvation of the state. Brutal reality proved the exact opposite. He handed his kingdom over to the enemy, just so he could sit on those bags of silver until the very last possible minute. Gnaeus Octavius delivers the captive king and his family directly to the consul. The Antigonid dynasty ceases to exist. As Justin acutely notes, the Macedonian state, tracing its origins all the way back to the first legendary ruler, Caranus, had existed for 923 years and had seen 30 kings sit upon its throne. For nearly a millennium, they built sprawling cities, subjugated entire continents, and dictated their absolute will to the ancient world. This 1,000-year history came to an end not in a glorious, heroic battle to the last breath, but in the exact moment when the richest man in antiquity walked out of a temple, unable to bring himself to spend his vast fortune on his own freedom. The state had fallen, but the Roman state machine understood a brutally harsh law of geopolitics. Slapping iron chains on a king is never enough to permanently kill a nation. It was necessary to completely dismantle the very anatomy of the state itself. Autumn, 167 BC. Rome is celebrating its monumental victory. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paullus throws a spectacular triumph, transforming the streets of the city into a 3-day deafening demonstration of absolute Roman supremacy. On the first day, 250 heavy wagons rumble with a hollow thud through the eternal city. They carry no captured grain or rusty barbarian armor. They are loaded to the brim with priceless art marble and bronze statues and stunning paintings violently ripped from the royal palaces of Pella and ancient Hellenistic temples. On the second day, 750 men march before the screaming crowd, bent double under the crushing weight of massive vessels. Inside, a blinding waterfall of silver coins shimmers in the sun. These are the very same heavy Macedonian tetradrachms that Perseus had so stubbornly hoarded in his vaults, the ones he was far too miserly to hand over to the Celtic mercenaries to save his own country. The metal that cost him his crown was now fully paying for a grand spectacle for a completely foreign people. On the third day comes the dramatic climax. Trudging heavily behind the gilded chariot of the triumphant conqueror is a man dripping in heavy iron chains. The grand heir to the glory of Alexander the Great, the ruler of what was until very recently the invincible military machine of the Balkans, had been permanently reduced to a living, breathing trophy. But one captive king was simply not enough for Rome. The Republic fully understood. A nation that had dictated its will to the world for centuries cannot be tamed merely by the pathetic sight of a defeated monarch. To permanently secure the Balkans, it was necessary to completely obliterate the very structural fabric of the Macedonian state. The Roman senators designed an unprecedented, cold-blooded plan of political demolition. Macedon was not simply turned into a standard province governed by a Roman magistrate. It was ruthlessly sliced into 4 entirely isolated republics, the Merides. These new barriers weren't just drawn on maps. They were brutally carved into the law itself. Rome categorically banned connubium, the legal right to intermarry between residents of different Merides. A young man from one district could no longer legally wed a girl from the neighboring one. Immediately after, they completely abolished commercium, the right to purchase property and conduct trade across these newly drawn internal borders. The nation was artificially butchered into fragmented pieces, forcing the people to entirely forget the very concept of a unified state, actively ripping apart centuries of deep cultural ties. Simultaneously, the Romans completely annihilated the robust economy that the late Philip V had so painstakingly built. The Republic ordered the gold and silver mines to be permanently sealed shut. The cutting of ship timber, the vital strategic resource that fueled the naval shipyards of the entire Mediterranean, was placed under the strictest, most absolute ban. The state's financial oxygen supply was entirely cut off. Without any mass executions or permanent occupying garrisons, Rome effortlessly transformed the richest power in the world into a fractured cluster of impoverished, divided, and utterly helpless territories. The Republic permanently erased Macedon from the political map with a single cold stroke of a stylus. The Antigonid dynasty ceased to exist entirely. The 1,000-year saga of the mighty Macedonian conquerors ended with their descendants being strictly forbidden from even chopping down their own trees. Perseus inherited an empire at the absolute peak of its power. His treasury was bursting with pure silver. His cellars safeguarded a 10-year supply of grain, and his entirely untouched Macedonian phalanx had already managed to draw blood from the Roman legions at Callinicus. But the ultimate paradox lies in the fact that the final great state of the Hellenistic world was destroyed not by the cold steel of enemy gladius swords, but by a miserly accounting calculation. Desperately trying to pinch pennies and save his gold on barbarian mercenaries, the ruler personally funded the total collapse of his own empire, and then violently tried to wash those saved treasures in the blood of his own deeply loyal officers, just to cover up a pathetic fit of panic. An empire does not perish at the exact moment its border fortresses crumble, but at the very second a monarch decides that the treasury exists solely for the sake of hoarding, rather than for the salvation of the nation. The Roman senators violently erased the 1,000-year homeland of Alexander from the political map, legally forbidding its defeated citizens from trading, marrying one another, or even cutting down their own ship timber. The glorious era of the mighty Antigonids had officially ended. But the sweet illusion of independence, which the Republic had so generously gifted to the rest of Hellas, proved infinitely more dangerous than direct, bloody military conquest. Among the thousands of noble captives shipped to Italy after the slaughter at Pydna was a young Greek aristocrat. Finding himself trapped in Rome, he completely refused to succumb to despair. Polybius decided instead to cold-bloodedly study the very system that had conquered the known world, ultimately transforming himself into its greatest chronicler. And while he was meticulously sketching the immutable laws of history onto parchment, out of the smoldering ruins of Macedon flared one final, desperate rebellion, led by a commoner who boldly proclaimed himself to be the resurrected son of Perseus. Exactly where this absolute madness will lead will become a legendary tale that puts the final, bloody period at the end of the history of a free Greece. Subscribe to the channel to witness the spectacular collapse of an entire civilization in our next episode, Polybius and the Pseudo-Philip, Anatomy of a Collapse. Hit the like button if you were absolutely stunned by the absurd, tragicomic miserliness of the last Macedonian sovereign. And be sure to let us know down in the comments, did Perseus actually have a real chance of surviving if he had just opened his chests for those 20,000 Galatians? Or would Rome have completely crushed him anyway? Thank you so much for being with us. See you next time.